and S&P says, it's on negative watch for 2 years from now. So this does not have to, for people holding big positions on long bonds, they're going to get debased hard the way they have been for years. So the biggest holder is not the Chinese or the Saudis. The biggest holder is U.S. pension funds. So, the average American, Main Street, just really had it socked to them again. So on a debasement, this is serious, but if you look at what should happen in the financial markets, it doesn't really have to rock and roll unless Mr. Global wants it to. Now, here is what is the case, and that is we're watching a profound shift in consciousness because there have been so many people who have been praying that the current paradigm could keep going. Now, 2008 sort of threw some of them off the consciousness Titanic. Those who didn't get thrown off of the consciousness Titanic, this will certainly rock them. The other thing it will do is it will create a real national security question mark, which is much more dangerous than what it might do in the financial markets, and that is, this is a signal that Mr. Global may think he's got enough money in his endowments to finance a global military without the United States federal budget. And if anybody gives that theory serious pause, then you're talking about basically, showing your jugular to the rest of the world with lots of people who, for good reason or not, would love to take a whack at us. So, it's going to be very interesting to see what the response is. But from a financial standpoint, the United States is still, has the strength of a AAA.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Catherine. Jules?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. In regards to what you just mentioned about profound shift in consciousness, Cliff has had linguistic data for a long time on the rise of the refuseniks and the Second American Revolution. There seems to be a clear disconnect between Wall Street and the U.S. economy, and it seems to be widening. And also in the last report, Cliff talks about the greatest wealth transfer in history. With the Arab Spring and various protests, including the ones happening now in London, which became violent, unfortunately, and 250,000 people marching in Israel, based on your experience working in your Solari circles, and because of your popularity, many people obviously talk to you, what is your opinion of the Second American Revolution, and what do you think people should do and not do?
Oh, that's a big one. Well, let me just ask you, what do you mean by the Second American Revolution?
What I mean by that is the widening gap between rich and poor causing the poor to revolt.
I think right now, over the last 30 years, the United States government has done an absolutely amazing job of creating tremendous dependency of every household and then every county and municipality on federal government money. So if you come into, America breaks down into 3,100 counties, and the financial dependency of individual people is extraordinary, and the poorer they are, the more financially dependent they are. And as a result, you have tended to see very sort of little revolution because, in fact, what you have is extraordinary financial dependency, whether it's on food stamps or housing subsidies or all sorts of job programs. It's quite extraordinary, and it's very not understood. There's tremendous absence of understanding about this particular situation. That's number one. The second thing is, if you look at the entrainment and subliminal programming on the media and possibly other means, what you're seeing is extraordinary mind control backed up with extraordinary manipulation within individual and personal networks. And so if you look at the extent to which, America is on mental and financial lockdown, it's quite extraordinary. And so it's very hard for me to fathom exactly how we would see a revolution, which is why I think to a certain extent it's so important that we have a revolution of consciousness. The other thing is you cannot underestimate enough the extent to which the average American on Main Street is complicit in the corruption. So, for example, if you look at the bankruptcy of America probably the greatest contributing factor was the strong dollar policy, and the key legs of the strong dollar policy. The most important one was the sort of entrapment of most Americans through debt, whether it was the housing bubble, student loan debt, which is arguably the most ugly and vicious. And if you look at that entrapment process, it depended, it wasn't something just done by the top guys. It was done by thousands and thousands of individuals, in every county in America. So the housing bubble was engineered by mortgage brokers and realtors and appraisers. Everybody was making money on it. And so there's a cleansing. Before you can have a resolution, people have to come clean in their own minds and hearts and pocketbooks. And that's the hardest part, not that the powers that be want to centralize, but at this point, so many people have been guilty of basically bankrupting America to help them. So that creates a situation which is much more, it's a little bit like saltwater taffy on the ground to get real change coming. Now, where is real change happening? If you look back and you see where have the powers that be have gotten absolutely stopped dead in their tracks, the answer is homeschooling. When it comes to people's children, they draw a line in the sand and they're willing to risk life and limb and pocketbook to protect their children. And so literally the powers that be, Mr. Global has gotten stopped dead on controlling education, and homeschooling is growing. The second place, hopefully, and the most critical to the economy is food freedom. So the right to eat, healthy food, organic food, raw food, the right for a farmer to sell to his neighbor without government regulation or interference. If we can draw the line in the sand and protect food freedom the way we have homeschooling, that's the basis of a real revolution, because it's a revolution that will be profitable. I live in Tennessee. If you go through Tennessee, thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs have been destroyed over the last 2 decades by rules that have literally made it impossible for small farmers, particularly dairy farmers, to function. You delete those rules, oh my God, you really turn things around. And then finally, there's all sorts of things you can do with local currency and local equity investment that if you stopped the powers that be from stopping that, if you just could get it going on a local basis, there's really the basis of turning things around. So when it comes down to a line in the sand, I think if we can draw a line on the sand in food freedom and circulating currency and equity locally, then we've got a real shot at a revolution. But it's going to take not rioting, which goes the other way, which is why the powers that be do so much to engineer riots. But it's going to take people really voting with their time and their money and their transactions and investments. So a revolution is possible, but it's going to have to deal with the money, and it may have to ultimately deal with taxes. And we have not seen any real indication yet on the ground that people are prepared to do that. And I think a lot of what the tactics have been are to prevent that from gathering and happening. Now, there's one sort of very hopeful sign I wanted to mention, and that is, and I think Cliff High and the WebBot had a major contribution in helping make that happen, and that was the pushback on the swine flu vaccination. The effort at mandatory vaccination got stopped dead in its tracks, and that was an American revolution. And it's if you kind of look under the cover and see how that happened, wasn't food freedom, but it was health freedom. And and that was a very optimistic sign, and you could see how frustrated and how dangerous Mr. Global could be when it gets stopped by that. So I think the solutions, the revolution on the ground has to come from a vision of a model. I said before that the economy is shrinking, but it's a political problem, not an economic problem. You have to have a vision on the ground and leadership that can envision not just a way to have a revolution, but have a way to have a highly profitable revolution, because that's what we need to do. We need to create we need to decentralize political power in a way that creates wealth, because the problem with what Mr. Global's doing is it's shrinking wealth, and it's basically throwing people overboard. So we have the good ship income, and people are being thrown overboard, which means we've got to reorganize in a way that will build small business, build enterprise, build income, build far more productivity on the ground than we have now. So there it is. That's that's a long answer, but that was a big question.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I intimated at the start, what should we not and not do? Definitely we should not go down the violent path. I mean, that's probably playing into their hands.
Yeah, absolutely.
In regards to political, and this is a political problem, not an economic problem, interestingly, the US debt ceiling was raised this week, but the global market still sold off, mainly because Europe is on the brink of collapse due to sovereign debt. There is currently a debate on whether there will be hyperinflation or deflation. Mike Rupert suggests resource constraints are now hindering the model of unlimited growth perception, which has been at the heart of current capitalist thinking. Firstly, what do you think of Mike Rupert's theory? And if Mike's theory is correct, wouldn't it stand to reason that limited resources would cause massive hyperinflation and even food shortages, fuel restrictions, and currency wars?
I think the idea of a global collapse is a bunch of bunk. Not to say that it can't happen or be engineered, but there's absolutely no reason for it to happen. If you look at, the resources we have available on planet Earth and the technology that we have, in theory, there's a way, for us to all live well together. But that's going to require literally civilization to advance significantly. What we have had on planet Earth for 500 years is something, sort of a model I call central banking warfare. The central banks print money, and then the folks with the guns make people take it and get natural resources in exchange for cheap, and then the value of the paper goes down. It's a global taxation system through the balance sheet. And the central banking warfare model has depended on enormous amounts of violence, both overt and covert. And it's a very, very primitive model. Now, it's very old, it's very deep. So getting 6 billion people out of a primitive model and into a civilized model is, that's not, I don't underestimate the challenge of that. But as an economic matter, if you look at the current economy optimizes within politically set barriers, or boundaries, and one of those boundaries is the rules and regulations. So for example, in the United States, rules and regulations basically make sure that corporations can consolidate market share and control of agriculture, and basically wipe out a lot of small businesses that are much more economic. So, we're not talking about an economic process, we're talking about a political. So one is rules and regulations, but the second is technology. If you look at the technology which exists versus the technology that's been allowed to be applied in healthcare, in energy, how many times have we solved cancer? Probably hundreds. And yet most people don't know that. So the boundaries that we're optimizing within are false boundaries. If you just said, okay, we're going to let whatever technology exists be free to develop and grow, it would be a very different world. Now, the problem is it'd be much more decentralized, and so, Mr. Global is afraid of that kind of out-of-control process. But the idea that, there's no doubt that on this planet, as population grows, we have a peak everything in terms of finite resources. However, if you look at the technology that we've kept out of the, in the closet or suppressed, there's no reason to think that economic collapse has to occur for material reasons, as far as I can tell. So, I don't disagree that we need to stop. Our current model doesn't work in this sense.